From Salem City with my washbowl on my knee, I'm going to Sacramento, the gold dust for to see. The heritage of Old Sacramento, the future of Old Sacramento. This is the authentic documentary of a gold mine of pioneer history and the potential for a new bonanza. Veiled in negligence, but still existent in a small segment of a modern city, here is Old Sacramento.
Many things have been said, many things have been written about Old Sacramento from the historical standpoint. Captain Sutter, the building of his fort, the arrival of the settlers, the gold rush, the fires, the floods, and all the colorful, romantic things that happened there. But little has been said about the look of the city, about its buildings as architecture. It was rather a barren look because it was a new city. It had thick masonry walls to ward off the attacks of fire. It had solid iron doors and shutters for the same reason. It had suffered one disaster after another and had rebuilt itself almost overnight. It had the determined, strong look of a city not to be defeated easily. Obviously, the new inhabitants soon learned that the sun was a cruel thing, and the wind could be bad, and the rains were sometimes incessant, so they immediately erected sidewalk shelters of one kind or another. These shelters gave the city its most characteristic look. Sometimes they were simple shed roofs, sometimes decks with balustrades, and on the later buildings were elaborate double-deck structures. Iron balconies completed the picture. Here and there, canvas was hung between the supporting posts to shut out the rays of the late sun. Signs and symbols clung to the eaves and parapets, and above the buildings flew banners announcing what services could be found beneath. All in all, strong, new, colorful. By 1865, all the major threats to the city's security had been conquered, or perhaps it would be better to say had been brought under control, with one exception. There was still the menace of the rivers. As lifelines to the outer world, they were invaluable. As companions, they were erratic. Each spring they became swollen, muddy destroyers of health and property. Something had to be done. And because this was a sturdy city, something was done. The entire city was lifted above the flood line, lifted 8.5 feet above its foundations. And endless wagon loads of dirt were hauled in, and the streets were set at a new level. The rear yards were left as they were, giving the city one more character line on its face. Sunken courtyards, tree-shaded and cool.
Curiously enough, in spite of the rush to rebuild this city on top of its own ashes, there was somehow time to consider such things as detail, proportion, and refinements, and there emerged a city with an air distinctly its own, with an architectural integrity not to be ignored. If you examine old lithographs and photographs and match them with the mutilated structures that stand there now, you will soon see that the early city had a visual impact as distinctly personal as the signature. No one would mistake a picture of the old quarter of New Orleans for any other place. Philadelphia has its own look, Boston its own, Williamsburg yet another. And the old quarter of Sacramento, properly restored, would be just as unique. This old general view of 2nd Street between J and K gives a very good indication of how historic Sacramento looked in the 1850s. On the extreme right is the B.F. Hastings Building, with the offices of Wells Fargo and Company in the south end, later the headquarters of the Pony Express. Next, the site of the Arcade Hotel. Next, the Adams Express Company. And then the Orleans Hotel, now replaced by an ordinary 2-story structure. Then the old Veranda Hotel, later rebuilt as the Union Hotel. And finally, at the end of the block, the Bank Exchange Cafe, originally a bank, made into a saloon in the 1850s, remaining the same down to the present time. Here, the same block today, the Hastings Building, the site of the Arcade Hotel, the Adams Building, nearly intact, the site of the Orleans Hotel, the stripped shell of the Union Hotel, and the Bank Exchange Cafe, a shadow of itself.
To those who have actually seen it, modern Sacramento has an identity, a valid one. The name evokes an image, a city of trees, a green oasis, set in the heart of a broad, flat valley, the capital city of a vast state. But there the image stops, unless you have been curious. If by chance you have found your way to Sutter's Fort, to the Crocker Gallery, the Stanford Lathrop home, and to the Gallatin Mansion, which now houses the governor, your mental image will be a little richer than most people's. It is no longer just a pleasant oasis. Color has been added. But your image is not as rich as it could be, because there is, still standing, much of the original 19th century city, right where it was, snuggled close to the river, its lifeline, its outlet to the sea. Of course you haven't seen it. In its present condition, ignored, cast out, few people would recommend you look for it, and no one but the hardy should try. But to those who have not seen Sacramento, the name calls forth another image. Europeans, as well as Americans, visualize the pioneer city. They see the sturdy little settlement alone in a great mountain-ringed valley, with a river its only lifeline to the outside. They see how it suddenly captured the imagination of men all over the world, how their hopes turned to it, as the needle turns to the magnetic pole. How, in faraway Paris, posters were hung, advertising shares in a mining company and passage to the gold mines, and how people came by the thousands. How the river became the broad highway from the sea, and how San Francisco prospered because of it. They also see how the river and land routes became too slow, communication too frustrating for these energetic people, and how, out of their need and imagination, the Pony Express was created. And then, because that was too slow, a telegraph line was strung pole by pole across the plains. And finally, how iron rails were made to inch their way across the untamed Sierra and across the plains until the two sides of a vast continent were joined. This is the picture, this is the image that comes to most men's minds when the name of the city is mentioned. The image has no form, only a spirit. Perhaps this ad for the Pony Express puts it into a visual form as nothing else could.
Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellas, not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred.
It is only natural that visitors should expect to see this city, or at least remnants of it. Pity the eager ones who go looking for it. There are no directional signs pointing to it, no guides to tell them about it. Only here and there a small marker to record what event took place within. Although they will be walking through the streets of a fairly complete 19th century city, only the very observant ones will see anything of interest. Much of it has been mutilated, is a mere shell. If they are not discouraged by the swarms of human jetsam about them and have the patience to search, they will be rewarded by a detail here, an iron column there, or even by some miracle a whole building. Unless the visitor has a strong imagination, he will wonder why he is there at all. The modern city seems to be ashamed of it, as an adolescent child will become ashamed of a parent. It has turned its back on it, as it has the river, and seems to hope that by ignoring it, it will all go away. It is no wonder that many sincere people see nothing there at all. Nothing but old decaying structures. Certainly nothing worth saving or restoring. What is so wonderful about all these old wrecks, they ask.
It isn't easy to explain, but with the help of old drawings and photographs, perhaps you can understand what it was that gave this 19th century city so much character, and how its architecture reflected the positive individuality of its inhabitants. It was the period after 1820, and all over the inhabited parts of the country, buildings were being designed in the style known as the Greek Revival. It was only natural that this new city should emerge in the same style. Perhaps it is also natural that, being so far removed from contact with other centers, this style would take on in Sacramento a local flavor, just as speech would take on a local accent. The American buildings of the 19th century turned to the temples of the ancient Greeks for their design sources, at first actually copying the temple shapes, but gradually changing these forms to suit their varied purposes. There was a self-conscious effort to create a new American style out of these ancient elements. The Greek style is based upon a very simple formula: uprights and horizontal bars, the so-called post and lintel type of construction. The column corresponds to the post, and the horizontal bar becomes the entablature. The gable end of the roof is known as the pediment. The column is divided into two parts: the shaft and the capital. The entablature into three parts: the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. The Greeks refined this system extensively, using a wide variety of ornamental parts, carving them with extreme distinction to make their buildings beautiful. These ornamental parts fall into three categories, known as orders. The first of these, favored by the Greeks themselves and later by the 19th century Americans, was called the Doric. It is distinguished by a fluted shaft, a simple capital, and an entablature with a decorated frieze, the cornice fairly simple. The second order, the Ionic, is somewhat more elaborate. The shaft is usually set on a base, and the capital is made of spirals, volutes, or ram's horns, with an egg and dart molding between. The architrave is divided into three parts. The frieze is usually sculptured. The cornice is more elaborately carved and often has a dentil course below. The last of the orders, used by the Greeks but preferred by the Romans, is the most elaborate of them all, the Corinthian. The shaft is more slender than the others and has a more extensively developed base. The capital has rows of acanthus leaves and corner spirals. In 19th century America, these parts took on new meaning. Doorways, windows, mantelpieces, even fire engines, everything in sight became Greek Revival. Perhaps the most dramatic use of the Greek Revival style in Old Sacramento was the design of Confidence Engine Company No. 1, constructed in the 50s. This building will show that how the Greek style was used from the east to the Midwest, rather than what happened to this style when it met the virile impact of a new city. The lower story is simple. Modified pediment shapes decorate the three doors. The second story, however, has an elaborate Ionic colonnade, with Doric pilasters or flattened columns on each side. Above, a simplified entablature. Above that, a balustrade, with Greek ornaments placed at each side. And finally, crowning the entire structure, a miniature round Greek temple in the Corinthian style, based upon the famous choragic monument of Lysicrates in Athens.
This drawing of the original D.O. Mills Bank shows the persisting influence of the temple form on commercial design. The Doric column has now become a simple granite pilaster. The entablature still shows a strong Greek influence, but the decorated frieze has become a band of lettering. The pediment shows the most change. It is now detached from the cornice and marks the beginning of its evolution into a purely local form. This is engine house number 3, still standing at 1112 2nd Street. Here the pediment and the architrave below are still very close to the pure Greek Revival style, the only local change being the panel for lettering. The rest of the building is something different. It shows modifications that are very significant in the study of these old buildings. Here is the proof that the personality of this vigorous city has taken over and has molded these ancient Greek forms to its own taste. The pilasters no longer reflect the bulk of the Greek column. Instead, they are drawn out or stretched. The addition of the recessed panels completes the evolution. The 3 windows are taller than usual. The iron balcony is in the taste of the 19th century. The Greek Revival style has been absorbed, blended into the local picture. For our purposes, the 3 windows are the most significant details on this building. Their tall, narrow shapes are to be repeated again and again throughout the rest of the century. The ornament that decorates them may change, may reflect many other sources other than Greek, but the basic feeling for height will persist. Watch for it. It is a mark of the city. In 19th century America, the temple form was easily adapted to public building design, but on commercial structures it was another matter. Having flat roofs for the most part, the pediment was no longer the end of a gable, so it took on a new form, still vaguely the same shape, but combined with a parapet and having a definite purpose, advertising. This is the upper part of a building standing at 1022 3rd Street. Here you can see all the style elements that we have just discussed, intact, Greek in origin, but adapted, translated into what was then a modern idiom, Sacramentan. Variations on this theme were repeated again and again until it became almost standard. The Hastings Building is a perfect example. 2 pediment shapes this time, a simplified cornice and below a dental course made of bricks. The reed block shows the same treatment, as does the Orleans Hotel, the Fuller Heather Building, and the Pioneer Telegraph Building. Sometimes these forms were made even simpler. This building at 218 J Street bears little resemblance to its great-great-great-grandfather, the Greek Temple. The Huntington Hopkins group shows the same treatment. The Adams Building has the typical pedimental sign that marks the early buildings. Beneath the cornice, brackets are used instead of a dental course. The Hayward Building had brackets as well. Further character was given to the style of the old city by the design of the ground floors. Again, the Hastings Building is our basic example. The tall, narrow openings echo the windows above and are undecorated. The same thing occurs on the reed block. And here, on the ground floor of the Adams Building, the spaces between the openings have been narrowed, and by the addition of a few moldings, the supports become an approximation of a Doric pilaster. The Hayward Building was treated the same way, as was Ebner's Hotel. These sturdy Doric pilasters were sometimes combined with equally sturdy arches, as seen here on the Scudder Carroll Building, and here on the H.S. Crocker Building, as it once looked. Another type of ground floor was found throughout the early city, a combination of slender iron half-columns, or pilasters, and flattened arches. Here at 218 J Street is a nearly perfect example of this type. The lower floor of the Pioneer Hall and Bakery shows the same treatment, as does the building to the far left of the Huntington-Hopkins group.
Meantime, another influence was making itself felt. Here on the Stanford warehouse we find the simple structural arch of the Romans used. The Brannon building on Front Street uses the arch in much the same way, except in this case there is an attempt to convert the brick uprights into a Doric pilaster with recessed panels. Around the corner, another Brannon building develops this theme further. The slender cast iron supports under the masonry arches give a delicacy of proportion not to be found in the other buildings. The ground floor of the Vernon Brannon building is another variation. It seems that the introduction of the Roman arch marked the beginning of a trend, away from the influence of the Greek revival toward Roman influence and later Italian. The ground floor of the Shasta Hotel shows this clearly. The metal pilaster is now Corinthian, the most favored order of the Romans, and the arches are fully developed. A variation of this can be seen on the ground floor of the Western Hotel.
Although Greek sources dominated the designs of the early years, numerous other influences affected the architecture of Sacramento as it advanced toward the end of the 19th century. But each one in turn was altered to fit the established taste, took on a local accent. Whether it was a reaction against the flatness of the valley, or an unconscious desire to express through height their new freedom, it would be hard to say. But the builders of the city consistently made all the forms higher, taller than usual. Let us go back for a moment to one of the oldest commercial buildings in the city, the Lady Adams Building, a survivor of the 1852 fire. Although the slender casement windows have been replaced by shorter, more modern ones, you can still trace the shape of the original openings, tall and narrow, even as they were before the fire. The following series of upper windows will show how strong this feeling for height must have been. This is the Hastings Building again. The windows are tall and narrow and deeply recessed. The reed block is the same, except for simplified pediment shapes above the windows. The Hayward Building has another variation. The Orleans Hotel, another. Engine House number 3, which you will remember from earlier pictures. The Vernon Brannon Building. The Huntington Hopkins Group. The Fig Building. And the Pioneer Bakery, somewhat different, but still elongated. All of these buildings were built about the same time and show clearly the influence of this local enthusiasm. In the Fashion Saloon, built in 1855, the long, narrow feeling persists. The Leggett Stewart Booth Building, dating about 1857, is another example. The detail is amusing and original, above high, narrow openings. On Capitol and 4th, built in 1858, and showing details derived from a great Roman palace, is a building that has windows in the same local manner. This is the Frat Building, built in 1870. Its detail is somewhat removed from the classical influence that so dominated the early city, but its soaring window shape served to emphasize the fact that no matter what influence was imported, the impact of the local taste would mold it, change it into something positive and Sacramentan. All of these buildings, restored with affection and with understanding, would bring a renewed character and identity to the modern city, qualities which it is in danger of losing forever. Restored as living things, they would supplement the present business area as an additional attraction. Attracting customers to the downtown area is the merchant's chief concern. Shopping malls, fountains, sculpture, babysitters, moving sidewalks, and endless acres of parking spaces all have been discussed. Restored properly, Old Sacramento could bring the downtown area more interest than all of these things put together. Destroyed, Sacramento would be just another American town with a shopping mall, the capital its principal identity.
This is but a portion of the full and rich story of Old Sacramento, a brief background on the momentous decision that now rests with the city and county of Sacramento, the state of California, and with the interests of the nation. Other cities, other communities have saved their heritage, some from the 18th century, some from the 19th. They have surrounded historic buildings with the vitality of modern living, have made the older structures not only visual links to the past, but part of the present. They have all found it profitable.
Here on the bank of the Sacramento River is not a single building, but a 19th century city, a symbol of the dynamic development of a vigorous new nation. Already, isolated fragments of it attract many visitors. Sutter's Fort alone counts more than 250,000 visitors annually.
As an exciting gateway to the modern city, a restored Old Sacramento would draw many thousands more. Consigned to oblivion by an octopus-like freeway, it would attract no one. The modern city would suffer a serious loss, its new bonanza wasted, its character less than it should be. Old Sacramento is a public service feature of the Bee and KFBK and was filmed in the studios of KMJ-TV, the McClatchy Broadcasting TV station in Fresno. The animated cartoons were created in the art room of the Bee. This is Hugh Taylor speaking, Public Relations of the Bee.